Vladni podcast GOVSI.
Lep pozdrav v novem podkastu GOVSI, v katerem se bomo vrnili znani temi, to je dezinformacijam. Ob začetku kampanje Preberi, premisli in preveri spomladi letos smo opravili pogovor s Simom Kumpasom iz Evropske službe za zunanje delovanje. Jeseni, torej zdaj, nadaljujemo pogovore na to temo, zato me izjemno veseli, da lahko v slovenski javnosti predstavimo uglednega profesorja iz Kalifornije, Nicholasa Culla. Nicholas Cull. Welcome, Mr. Cull.
Thank you.
Let me put some words about you, and then I'm going to invite you to present yourself to Slovenian public. Nicholas Cull is presented by his university as a pioneer scholar and educator in the field of public diplomacy.
Yes.
He is historian of the role mass communication and in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Nicholas Cull is actually British,
Yes.
ex-European, but after the Brexit.
After Brexit, yes.
You lost that, and you're just American now.
No, I'm just an American. Yes, that's true.
Just continue. You can.
But I would say that of all these things, it's important that my background is in history. Because I feel that with this question of disinformation, one of the most important things is to understand that this is not something that has been invented in the last 5 years. This has always been with us. There are even examples of disinformation in ancient times. I have some in my book. I have examples from ancient Greece. So I think the point, Zoran, is that it may seem overwhelming now, but if we reflect on a long-term understanding of how to deal with this problem, we have a lot more knowledge and a lot more experience at our disposal than we might originally think. So it's like that the book on babies that begins, "Don't panic, you already know more than you think." We should have that in a book about disinformation too. Don't panic, we do know how to deal with this if we take it seriously and if we think about it carefully.
And if someone is interested in your lectures, he could go to California. Where is your faculty?
In Los Angeles, University of Southern California. Yes, that's right.
Okay. Disinformation that you mentioned, that's not a new phenomenon. What is the difference between what is disinformation today, and what's the difference with comparing to propaganda?
Okay. Well, my definition of propaganda is that it is a mass communication conducted for political reasons. So political mass communication. I don't think propaganda has to necessarily be dishonest or malicious. I think sometimes people just want to persuade a public to do something. However, we live in a world where the word propaganda is a bad word, and there are historical reasons for that it's been associated with actors who were considered bad in the judgment of history. The term originated with the Vatican, so because so much history was written by people who didn't like the Vatican, their favorite word for describing spreading the faith from 1540 onwards became a negative word. But it didn't begin that way. However, disinformation is much more specific. Whereas you can say there's a neutral form of propaganda, there's no neutral form of disinformation. Disinformation is communicating something which you know to be untrue for a disruptive reason. So the only reason somebody spreads disinformation is to make life harder for their adversary. And so I see it as a particular tactic of propaganda, and one of the maybe least moral tactics in the propaganda toolbox.
Well, disinformation is not a new phenomenon, as you mentioned. What's the difference between disinformation in Cold era and now, maybe.
Yes.
But
Okay. Well, to be as a historian, one of the things I've looked at was how the United States dealt with Soviet disinformation in the Cold War, and I was able to talk to the experts who fought against that disinformation, and some of them were able to compare to what's happening now, that they're still alive. And the big story, the devastating story used by the Soviet Union in the Cold War was the idea that the HIV/AIDS virus was an American biological weapon which had escaped. But if you look at how that story was prepared and launched, it took years to design and launch that story in a convincing way. Part of the way that that was done was by faking and publishing scientific journal articles, and then reporting it in newspapers in Africa, which would then be quoted in a newspaper in Egypt and in a magazine in India, until over many months, there was an impression that multiple researchers in many countries in the world had come to the conclusion that the AIDS virus was a biological weapon that had gone wrong. So this was a successful and very disruptive disinformation story. But you jump forward to our present times, and disinformation stories are not created with that level of attention to detail. It's like comparing a novel with just a joke or something that somebody has thought up in half an hour. But because of the power of the internet, disinformation stories, you can have, so the British Foreign Office counted 32 different disinformation stories around a single incident in Britain, the attempted poisoning of former Russian agent Sergei Skripal in 2017, and I think that the Kremlin objective in publishing through the embassy website 32 different versions of explanations, 32 explanations for that incident. They weren't trying to convince anybody. They were just trying to maximize doubt. So characteristics of disinformation today would be the attempt to throw multiple explanations at a single incident and not care if most of them are ignored. The enemy is no longer an ideology, really. It's just the idea of truth, right? It's like an assault on the idea that the world is knowable. Because if the world isn't knowable, if nothing's true, then you just trust the strongest man in the building, who, from the Kremlin point of view, is Mr. Putin. So why would they care about truth?
Well, strategy a little bit changed. 40 years ago, there was importance in quality. Now it's quantity.
Now it's quantity. Yeah,
just
absolutely. This is it.
Because now, the technology.
Yes, it's quantity. It's flooding the market with contradictory stories, so that people don't know what's true and mistrust everything. But I think,
and disinformation is now such a phenomena that the forums like G7, G20 are discussing that topic. That's quite unusual to discuss that phenomena to that level.
Well, I think it's very important that they do, and to me, my sense is that we have to re-examine the nature of the security of the state. And part of how a state becomes secure is by ensuring its reputation is secure. And we can see, based on what our adversaries are doing, that they're seeking to attack the reputation of states, to make people doubt the integrity of the state, to make its citizens doubt the integrity of the state, to make its neighbors doubt that state. And our challenge then is, how do you develop reputational security? Now, this goes beyond the way in which reputation worked in the immediate post-war period, where small countries would bring in somebody to come up with a good logo or a slogan and brand the nation and seek to build soft power. All right? I don't think that's what we're doing now. We're not trying to get more tourists. We're not trying to increase our exports. Now, if you can communicate a reputation that people admire, when something goes wrong, you've got a chance of surviving. So to explain what I mean, compare the problem for Ukraine in 2014, when nobody knew what the country was, when its story wasn't known around Europe, and Ukraine in 2022. In 2014, Ukraine was reputationally insecure. Nobody knew their story. By 2022, they had succeeded in building a reputation, explaining what the country was, what was the nature of their threat. And when Ukraine was threatened in 2022, Europe reacted and came to the defense of the country and argued that Ukraine had to be supported. And part of that was understanding the threat of disinformation. But part of it as well was that Ukraine had worked to not be the stereotype that it had in 2014, but to develop its democracy further, to actually be a more admirable place. And I think that a all-around reputational security strategy has not only defeating the disinformation that's being targeted at you, but also has to do with reform and paying attention to problems that you and your allies have, so that the disinformation is less critical. And this goes even less valid. This even goes to the United States. So for me, when the Russians were saying in the Cold War, oh, the United States is a racist country, the wisest American leaders understood you don't only show the ways in which that isn't true, you also reduce the ways in which that is true. So this is, to me, a complex reputational security strategy.
Yes, because we are now in the interesting time, because information is the core of our world, of democracy.
Yes, absolutely.
And with the disinformation techniques, and you saw disorder, you threaten democracy. What are the techniques? How can democracy defend itself?
Well, the first thing to do is to understand that democracy is under attack. I think that disinformation is a challenge for everybody, so we should have a conversation that includes everybody to build a defense against disinformation. You need to understand what the nature of the disinformation is, so a response begins with listening. We need to track disinformation and to see where stories are being introduced, which populations are being exposed to which stories. And one of the techniques that worked in the Cold War was to take a story that the main adversary, the Soviet Union at that time, was using in one location, and then showing the use of that story to a different public. And because that shows the lack of credibility of the country using the disinformation. So, Britain has done very well by showing how Russia used multiple ridiculous contradictory stories to describe the Skripal attack. And this diminishes the credibility of the Russian foreign ministry as a communicator. So you need to listen to be able to say, but this foreign ministry, they said one thing on Monday, another thing on Tuesday, another thing on Wednesday, another thing on Thursday, because the foreign ministry concerned assumes that people will only listen on Wednesday, or some people will only listen on Monday. They don't assume somebody is listening every day, comparing and then publishing their claims. So I believe that exposing disinformation is the beginning of this.
Yes, and in this information environment, there is a role of media and journalism.
Yes.
Both play an important role in that society. Information and journalism has been changing. The principle of citizen journalism is arising. Mainstream media, especially print media, has become weaker.
Mm-hmm.
And fact-checking methods have become increasingly lax.
Yes.
So that creates perfect condition for the spread of disinformation.
Absolutely.
How can journalists, media, uphold their credibility, trust, as a response to the increasing prevalence of disinformation?
Well, I think this is a massive problem, and it's made worse in places where the media is market sensitive, where media is being driven by a desire to, or a need to make money, because the media want to be first with the story and would rather be first with a big story and get a lot of attention than be last, but be 100% accurate. So even a minor story, like the story of the Australian breakdancer, Ray Gunn, right? That story has attracted tremendous rumor. Like there's a rumor that her husband was part of the mechanism through which she was selected for the Olympics. And this was widely reported by legitimate media. Now, I'm sure this wasn't a Russian conspiracy to undermine Australian sport diplomacy, but it's still done damage, and it shows how people are willing to repeat something that sounds plausible so they are enhanced in their own social network. How we deal with this, where it counts, I think, is through the development of the fact-checking infrastructure. So the case I've looked at most is the case of Ukraine, where a fact-check website was established called Stop Fake, and other European nations helped Ukraine to develop this site in multiple languages. And you can go to Stop Fake and check a story, see if it's genuine. You can see where stories have occurred before. And often disinformation is quite lazy, and you'll find, this is a repeat of an old story, like the idea that the Americans have a secret biological warfare laboratory in Ukraine is a major story, which is an obvious recycling, not only of the Cold War stories, but the Korean War stories. Going back, yeah, absolutely. The major East Bloc allegation about the Americans in Korea in the 50s was that they were using biological weapons against North Korea. So this is very uninventive stuff, and it comes round and round and round. We can even predict what some of the stories are going to be, and that is one of the major breakthroughs, to predict and say, when things change next week, or we think Putin is going to invade, and when he does, he's going to say X, Y, and Z. And when he does invade and does say X, Y, and Z, it doesn't only remove his credibility, but it puts him into a hole as somebody who can really not be trusted. I think this is a great. It's called the pre-bunking technique, yes. And it's a very effective technique.
Yes, but in the era of artificial intelligence, which can produce a lot of deep fakes and so on, it's very hard for the public to distinguish.
But that's what, Zoran, this is why we have to talk about this. And it's great that you're having this conversation. So I think that some media has done a really good job of explaining that people should expect deep fakes. And my mother who's over 90 years old, and called me the other day, and she was saying, you have to look out at photographs. Be sure to count the number of fingers in a photograph, because artificial intelligence can't create hands yet. So the hands always look a bit funny. So if you're looking at a photograph online, check the number of fingers. So this message of being a critical audience member has even reached 91-year-old ladies living in England. Now, that is a good sign. It's a good sign that people are tuning in to the potential for deepfake manipulation, but we're facing a tremendous challenge, and the ability not just of malign political actors to use deepfakes, but there's a story right now about teenagers in South Korea creating pornographic images of classmates using the tools they have on their cell phones to do this. So this is going to be an interpersonal societal issue. The more we work on building a literate public, a public that's informed about the dangers of disinformation and AI, and the sooner we do that, the better. But I don't think I think should be a priority, even at kindergarten, to tell kids about disinformation and AI fakes. Yes,
discussion and education. But do you think that this is enough? Because every effort to regulate, for example, I don't know, social media and so on, is labeled as the restrict to freedom of speech. We can follow that discussion in.
But of course it is, because some people have a vested interest in being able to do whatever they like and making as much money as possible. One thing, as a British person who's now no longer an EU citizen, I miss the EU's regulation, because this is an insulation for EU citizens from the worst excesses of the internet. I think regulation and regulatory authorities are important and are a check. What I tell my students is that you can't expect, you can't expect a tech millionaire to vote for his own restrictions. He's always going to argue that he should have a complete freedom to say whatever he wants. But you have to rein in that impulse and do what's best, not for one billionaire, but for an entire society.
In what ways has the spread of disinformation eroded public trust in journalism and traditional media outlets? Where we are now, in your opinion?
Well, I think the problem is that regardless of content, the structure of the media environment has undermined legacy media. In the past, media has always come to us through an editor. Right? Media has been curated. Now,
regulator.
Yes, either a regulator or just somebody who said that goes in the newspaper, that story doesn't go in the newspaper, and acts as a gatekeeper. Now we are our own gatekeeper, and we judge whether we're going to share media based on who did it come from. Right? Do I trust the person who sent this story to me? Which usually we think, are they somebody like me? And that can be exceptionally like from the same street. It's not just a little bit like me. Do they speak Slovenian? Right? It means, are they the same age as me? Do they also like Taylor Swift? And so there are extraordinary levels of similarity. And the other part of choosing whether you're going to pass on a message is this message going to make me look better to my own social network?
That means, you are saying that every citizen should be some kind of editor.
Well, the problem is every citizen is some kind of editor, but not every citizen knows it.
Yes.
So waking up citizens to their responsibility as an editor to their network, this is part of what we need to do. And to say, it was possible during the pandemic. to teach people about social distancing. Now we need to understand not only do you not stand next to somebody when you've got a cough, also when you've got a piece of information, you have to think once, think twice before you pass it on. Because just as you don't want to be the person who gives somebody a virus, you don't want to be the person who gives somebody a false story. So I think part of good citizenship around information is thinking before you send on a story, but also maybe pushing back against a friend who sends you something that you don't welcome, who sends you something that's tendentious, that's looks like disinformation, and saying, do we really want to, we don't need this. When I was a kid in the UK, every joke was an ethnic joke. That was the main thing we joked about, was differences between ethnic groups. But at some point that stopped, and that involved people saying, you know what, I don't want to hear a joke about a Scotsman and an Irishman going into a bar. Let's talk about something else. And we have to have this attitude to disinformation. We have to feel, you know what, I don't want to share this, but also I don't really want to hear it. And if people feel that there's a social disincentive to sharing disinformation or something that might be disinformation, then the whole engine of spreading disinformation, which has always been looking cool within your network, that is cut off. And that's what happened in the past, right? During World War II, there were posters that would say, be careful what you say, you never know who's listening, don't pass on rumors, and even cartoons demonizing people who love to spread stories. They were made to seem absurd and creating a negative image for people who spread rumors undermines the main reason that they do it. Because the people who spread disinformation think of themselves as being more intelligent because they're trying to find the real truth of what's going on in a situation. So identifying, and they actually are more intelligent, or statistically more intelligent, but having them worry about being seen as being less intelligent is the way that you start to de-incentivize the spreading of disinformation.
Maybe practical advice is what proactive measures can news organizations implement to minimize the spread of disinformation on their platforms?
Well, I think content moderations are in that. It's really important that you pay attention to what's being said on your platform and have good community guidelines, and to maybe warn people who are coming on the site to be careful what they post. And there's also a whole ecology out there of fake users, bots, and inauthentic websites that tweet and retweet, and to encourage people to be on the lookout for fake user for artificial presence online. And I think sometimes people know about this in terms of social interactions, that they figure that there probably isn't a rich young girl from China who's interested in being their online friend. That's probably a bot, but somebody who's passing on a story about the corruption of a politician, they may be less critical in recognizing a political bot than they are recognizing a bot on a more social level.
Well, that's a whole society approach, building the resistance environment against disinformation. But what's the role of for example, government? What can governments do to limit the spread of disinformation, and how far can go to ensure that we don't descend into total control and censorship? What can government do in that environment?
Well,
what kind of measures?
I think that media education is important. I think that nurturing a free and transparent media culture is important because we know that people believe disinformation when they don't have other sources about a story. So nobody's interested in disinformation about a story that they know they are completely informed about, right? Disinformation comes in to fill a gap when there is a blind spot. So the more that government can avoid the blind spot, the less likely it is that their population will seek a disinformation explanation. So transparency, investment in free media, tolerance of media that is hostile or critical of the government, even welcoming a level of criticism. This is part of how a country builds a democratic sensibility that is resistant to disinformation. So I think that that there is a right now democracy really is challenged, and disinformation is exploiting a challenge. It's also exploiting an economic downturn and a difficult moment coming out of the pandemic. So we have to meet that challenge head on and rediscover, reassert democratic values. And that's the environment in which it will be, in which disinformation will find it hard to prosper.
For the end, can you give some kind of advice to ordinary consumer of the news information, how to survive in this digital era with a lot of...
Well, my favorite advice actually comes from, God. Might sound rather surprising, but do you remember in the Bible, at the very beginning, when Adam and Eve have eaten from the tree of knowledge and they are suddenly aware of their nakedness, and God comes upon them in the garden and they're hiding, and they say, oh, we're hiding because we're naked. And what does God say? Do you remember? Who told you that you are naked? Who told you that you're naked? And that is a really important question that every time we look at media, we should ask, where does this media come from? Where does this message come from? But especially when the message is undermining our society. So when we see our society and our values challenged, we should say, who told us that we are naked? Who told Europe that its democracy falls short? Who told us that our alliances aren't real? Who told us that there is no meaning in our structures, that there is no difference between a world of oligarchs and a world of reliable institutions? And seeking out who told us these things will, I think, build a resilience against believing these things. So keep in mind who says so, who is behind that message. Being an informed consumer, and even more importantly, an informed distributor of information, is the key to defeating this challenge.
Are you optimist, pessimist?
I am optimistic about the ability of people, when they really reflect and stabilize around a challenge, to come to the right decision. And I think if we believe in democracy, we have to have confidence in the people, but people have to recover the best in democracy, which I think is not in speaking and expressing your views as much as in listening to each other and understanding each other as fellow members of a community. So I'm optimistic in the process. but it takes a while when a new media has become available for publics to understand the damage that can come from that medium. So it's like when a body that has to get used to a new virus, we have to develop the antibodies to help us stabilize in the presence of a new virus, and we have to develop media literacy specific to a new to a new mechanism of communication. And I think we are doing that with social media. The world is starting to come to terms and to restabilize. The problem is that as we're restabilizing, artificial intelligence comes along, and we have to, as we're completing one process, we're beginning another, and presumably something will come after artificial intelligence, and then another thing and another thing. So the scale of technology means that we cannot rest. We have to always be thinking about the integrity of our media environment, and that's why this needs to be, from kindergarten onwards, a thing we talk about, part of parenting, to ask, where does this message come from? Why is somebody saying that? Is that really what you want? And, a lot of people will say we don't need to do that, because can you imagine a world if advertising wasn't effective? But we have to rise above that and talk seriously about media for the future and stability of our way of life.
Okay, time's up. Nick, thank you for your optimism and sharing it with us.
Oh, you're very welcome. And Zoran, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be in Slovenia. Pleasure to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
And first time in Slovenia.
First time, yes, absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed.
Very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.